Today on the show, we sit down with Kevin Graybill to talk about mindfulness and how we can develop a more meaningful dialogue in our lives. Kevin is a Seattle-based entrepreneur who splits his time between working as Director of Operations for the educational consulting group Socratic Seminars International and operating as the founder-director of consulting group Full Circle Dialogue. This is The Career Cue, the podcast focused on helping you navigate the signals in your career to keep you growing and moving forward in business and in life. Here's today's host, Stacy Harris.
Kevin, thanks so much for being here today. It's so great to sit across from you and have this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm excited to have this conversation because you and I have already had at least one conversation about this. So I'm actually really looking forward to sharing it with our listeners. And just so our listeners know, in case you hear a fire engine go screaming past, we're sitting in one of the phone booths at Impact Hub Seattle, which is a shared workplace space in downtown Seattle. So we're gonna have a little bit of ambient noise, but I actually just think it adds to the atmosphere, especially as the topic that we're talking about today, which is mindfulness and developing more kind of meaningful dialogue as we go through our lives. So Kevin, before we get into that, let's actually talk about your professional story and how you got to ultimately where you are today.
Yeah, so for the past 8 years or so, I've been Director of Operations for an educational consulting group called Socratic Seminars International. And what we do is we train K through 12 teachers in how to facilitate the dialogue strategy, Socratic seminars with their kids. And one of the ways that we do that is at open registration workshops all across the country. And at these workshops, it's a collection of different teachers from different schools, and some people know each other, but a lot of times it's just a big melting pot of different people. And I started to notice a common trend, whether our workshop was in the South or it was in New England or it was in Seattle. And at the beginning of the workshop, everyone would kind of be fragmented, people aren't talking to each other as much. And after some container building and setting the intention for conversation, everyone actually got to sit in a circle together and practice this dialogue strategy that they were bringing into the classroom with their kids. And when that would happen, a shift would always occur. And now I'd see a sense of community, and people are being mindful with each other and compassionately listening to each other. And it would last the rest of the day, and I started to think to myself, this is a great strategy to have in the classroom with kids, get them to think differently and ask better questions of each other. But there might be something to this as far as living a balanced life as a human being in general. Everyone was just lit up for the rest of the day, and we're engaging in meaningful conversations with new people. Doesn't happen that much nowadays, with everyone looking at their phones and being stuck in, a new screen to look at, be it a tablet, be it your phone. Now people are really looking into each other's eyes. Anyways, I did a little research on, is this really part of a balanced experience for a human being? And have you heard of the study, the Blue Zones Project, by any chance?
I actually read a little bit about it on your Full Circle website.
Okay.
But actually, why don't you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, so I think it was 10 years ago or so, National Geographic teamed up with a group of longevity researchers to figure out, what are the common denominators between different cultures where people tend to live longer. And they identified these quote-unquote blue zones, these little pockets all across the world where people were living to 100 years old at like 10 times the rate of us in the U.S. And I started thinking, what's up with these little pockets, these blue zones? And they came up with about 9 different common denominators. And a lot of people tend to focus on the diet and the food that people are eating, and exercise and things of that nature. But about a third of those qualities of the blue zones are really community-based. These people are all part of a community. And something all communities have in common is communication. There's communication in all communities. There's a great quote by Mortimer Adler, who's a big dialogue advocate, that there can be no community without communication. And they share the same root words, but it can't be any type of communication that builds community. It has to be the type where we're making meaning together and we're thinking together, which is really the quality of authentic dialogue. And a lot of people tend to use those words interchangeably, discussion, dialogue, and debate, different types of conversational styles, but they all have different qualities and they produce different outcomes. Yeah, so dialogue is really the quality of conversation that's most conducive to building community. And there's a ton of different specific qualities of dialogue, and we don't have time, frankly, to get into all of those qualities, but all of them I've found pretty much fall under the umbrella of three bigger qualities. And those are mindfulness, compassion, and the idea of interconnectedness. So mindfulness, how would you define mindfulness if you had to say in your own words, or being mindful?
Oh,
no
okay.
right answers here.
Yeah,
no
yeah.
Right answers.
Okay. Just being more aware of not only myself, but my surroundings.
Right. Yeah, so being aware, being mindful. And in dialogue, it's bringing that into our conversations and really learning how to listen to ourselves. So that's a big part of dialogue. And then compassion. How might you define compassion? Many different ways, people.
Putting myself in the other person's shoes and trying to understand how is it that they want to experience this current engagement and how they want to feel about it when they leave it.
Right.
I don't know, Kevin. I'm the person that's asking. I'm the person that's asking the questions.
Well, in the spirit of dialogue, I just can't help but to engage you.
The table has been turned. Well done.
Yeah, but a lot of people, define compassion generally as to be kind, to give, and like you're saying, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And what better way to put yourself in someone else's shoes and practice compassion than to give your full attention to someone. So take that mindfulness that you're establishing, that stillness in yourself, and giving that to someone else. So that's the idea of compassion in conversation that's found in authentic dialogue. And then that idea of interconnectedness, it's a little fuzzier and there's different ways to perceive it. But a lot of people think, I can't get into that place of oneness and interconnectedness with other people around me. We all have different opinions. Our opinions are too different, our belief system is too different. But if everyone can collectively practice these qualities of dialogue, like listening deeply to yourself and listening deeply to the person in front of you, then we're all in that same state of consciousness. And I would argue that most of the best conversations you've had, whether you know it or not, you're probably practicing dialogue. When you're in that place of you feel very connected to the person in front of you, most of the best conversations we have are dialogue, and people don't know it. So this is a way of defining what we already know feels great. And the thing is, coming full circle here, these qualities of dialogue that contribute to building community, that contribute to living longer, really, as has been found in the blue zones, comes from the fact that there's been studies done. When you practice these qualities of dialogue, different parts of your brain get engaged versus when you practice qualities of a more debacious conversation. I might have made that word up. But,
it sounds good.
Argumentative,
sure.
Contentious, unproductive conversations. They've done studies and it's shown that when you get into those type of conversations, those ones that really don't feel very good, you're engaging your amygdala, the reptilian part of your brain. You get into that fight or flight mode. And at that point, whether you are in a business meeting or trying to work something out with your significant other, the way that human beings are wired, when we get into that type of conversation, not only is it killing us through flooding our body with hormones like cortisol, stress hormones, but we can't even come up with new ideas. We're unable to think together with someone else. So the practice of dialogue engages a different part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And when we get into that place of connectivity with someone, and the prefrontal cortex, when it's highly engaged, releases oxytocin through our bodies, we're in that state where we're doing something really healthy for our bodies, but we're also able to come up with new solutions with people that we're talking to and get into that place of connectedness. So long story short, through my work with Socratic Seminars, working with teachers, and just figuring out, why are these workshops so powerful for teachers, I began taking that strategy out of the classroom, so to speak, and into various communities and organizations to give them the tools that from dialogue that can really produce amazing outcomes on an individual level and a group level as well.
So, Kevin, we had a preliminary conversation over the phone before today's interview. I had so many great notes that I'd actually taken from that conversation, and that's one of the reasons why I'm excited for this interview today, is to be able to share it with other folks. But one of the biggest kind of ahas that you had shared with me that day was the three basically underlying goals that every single human being has. So do you want to share with our listeners what those three are? Because I really feel like it resonate with everyone.
Right. What I believe is something that everyone has in common, that all human beings desire, regardless of your ethnicity, your belief system, your background. And that's that all people really want to be heard, understood, and valued. And I'm sure many people can relate to this, but it doesn't happen that often. It really doesn't, whether it's at home or at work. And one of the best ways to give that gift to people, to make people feel heard, understood, and valued, is through listening deeply. And a lot of times we aren't. A lot of times we're hearing, but we might not be listening. We might not be fully present with someone. And that's something that you can start doing right now. I think the best way to incorporate dialogue into an organization or a community is to bring someone in, if not me, just someone to facilitate, build the containers, set the intention to get everyone collectively practicing dialogue. But right now, as an individual, you can go out and begin practicing that deep listening, and not only will it make the person in front of you feel better, but it's contagious as well. Compassion yields compassion. There's a great Nelson Mandela quote that goes something along the lines of, when you liberate yourself from fear, your presence alone liberates those around you. And I think fear is an important word, and we haven't talked a lot about that yet, but really every single time a human being meets a new human being for the first time, just the way that we're wired from an evolution perspective is we collect a lot of different data points, a ton, more than we even really understand probably. And we make a quick decision, do I trust or do I fear this person? And one of the easiest ways to build trust and get put in that trust bucket is simply by listening. Simply by listening and sending that message that I value you. And that's a big part of the practice of dialogue, is listening. There's a ton of different qualities, and we won't even scratch the surface on all of them today, but all of them start with that foundation of listening.
So Kevin, you actually kind of touched on, it's not a very big word, but I think it's a powerful word, and the word is fear. So while we may not, as you mentioned, recognize that we may be feeling a fear, that our bodies can sense it, and it comes through engagements that we have throughout our day. So how is it that we can put into practice not only the setting the intention, we'll get into that here in a bit, but how can we practice on the people around us that we maybe find to be trusted sources already, or going into, on the other hand, a new engagement with someone new? How do we become more mindful of that fear, and how can we push past it?
Well, it really all comes down to listening, and two types of listening. The first type is really learning how to listen to yourself. Some could call that being more mindful. Some could call that, being more aware. But finding that stillness in yourself and bringing, not that you have to be a seasoned meditator to be able to do this, but bring the idea of meditation into your conversations more. I think that's a big problem, is that a lot of people are becoming more open to certain practices of introspection, whether it's a spiritual practice or meditation, but a lot of times it's left where they practiced it, and they don't bring it into the arena, our day-to-day lives enough. There's a great quote by a spiritual guru that goes, life should be a balance between the mountaintop and the marketplace. And I thought that was a good quote. My perception was that the mountaintop is your spiritual practice, wherever you find stillness, wherever you can cultivate that equanimity to take on the world and the challenges in the marketplace, so to speak, the chaos that we go back to after, let's say, a yoga class or your seat on the meditation cushion. But I thought that the quote comes up a little bit short, in the sense that should we be separating those places completely? Should we leave the marketplace feeling exhausted and need to go back to that practice? Or can we bring more of that mountaintop into the marketplace? And what's something we do in the marketplace a lot, every single day, with our mouth and our ears? Stacy, can you help me with that?
We communicate.
We communicate.
Yes.
Yeah. I think on average, women say 20,000 words a day, and men say something like 7,000 or 8,000, which also puts in perspective that one gender really needs to practice deep listening to the other. But it just shows that there's a huge opportunity there, and it's missed a lot of times, that we can bring that stillness, that place of mindful introspection into those conversations and make other people's lives much easier, and also ourselves.
And I would assume the answer is yes, but the value of actually maybe taking pause and recognizing perhaps when you don't feel like you've brought that mountain into the marketplace, and finding an opportunity to be able to take a deep breath and say, I'm going to be more intentional about this engagement that I'm walking into, or I want to be able to provide an opportunity for dialogue versus it just throwing out 3,000 words in the course of an hour. Which apparently is my quota. That 20,000, I challenge that 20,000. But that actually speaks to the fact that perhaps I have room to be able to do more listening. And the pace in which we move through life, there are so many conversations that we have, or different types of communication. But the ones that we remember were the ones where we were listening deeply, and that we were engaged deeply and in that moment, and not being distracted by the noise, right? That was around us. So we're actually going to take a quick break, but when we get back, Kevin's actually going to share with us, he'd mentioned a couple of times building a container or setting intention. So let's dive into that when we get back.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out the show notes at thecareerq.com, where you can also subscribe to the podcast and sign up for our newsletter.
So today we're here talking with Kevin Graybill. And Kevin, before the break, we talked about a ton of great things, but you'd actually mentioned a few times about building a container or setting the intention. So can you actually kind of elaborate further on that for our listeners so they can figure out how they can go out and build their own?
Right. I feel like a big problem with lots of conversations, whether it's in your personal life, whether it's at the company or organization you work for, a community you're a part of, is a lot of times there isn't much intention setting going into the conversation. Whether it's a contentious conversation or whether it's just brainstorming, a lot of times it's just, let's sit down at the table and let's just start talking about these issues, whatever they may be. But a big part of what I do and what I advocate for is spending an equal amount of time, if not more time, than the actual conversation on building the container or the scaffolding for that conversation to take place within. And that can really be broken down into a couple different elements. One is something that's not given nearly enough credit. It's the physical structure of how does this conversation look? What's the seating arrangement? A lot of times you end up at a long rectangle table, and there's clearly one person sitting at the head of the table, and it establishes some low-level anxiety about there's hierarchy there. And a lot of times that's not considered enough. And I'm a big advocate, and this might seem like it would be strange to incorporate in an office setting, but it works. I'm a big advocate for sitting in a circle. And some might think, oh, that's a bunch of woo-woo stuff. We're not gonna sit in a circle. But the root words of conversation translate to turn together. To have a true, authentic, genuine conversation, we all need to seamlessly turn together and see each other, make eye contact with each other. And also, what happens in a circle? There's no hierarchy. Everyone's on the exact same level. And that makes a huge difference. Talk about trust. Talk about trust versus fear. When we're all on that same level, it lends itself to a collective trust. So there's the physical structure, but then there's also a collective agreement that everyone needs to come on as far as what are the qualities of conversation that we're all going to practice. I'm not saying these are the qualities of conversation that we are going to achieve every time. We can reflect on that afterwards, but they should be challenging and they should be a practice. So I'm a big advocate, as you can imagine, for the qualities of dialogue, which come in many different shapes and forms. It can be a bullet-pointed 10 to 20 quality list. It could just be 5. And as far as the specific qualities, I'm sure you can imagine they're under the umbrella of mindfulness, compassion, interconnectedness. We don't need to get into all of those qualities right now. But the idea of, do we have a collective agreement on our qualities of conversation? And maybe even pick one of them out. If you think listening deeply to understand instead of listening to reply, maybe that's one of your qualities of conversation. We all know how that feels, to be caught in a place of listening to reply and not understand. So maybe you take a little time and you have everyone pair off and you practice some deep listening before you get into that core conversation. And listening is something that I think is, the practice of it, I think is huge in the container building process, because think about your lives. Think about your standard K through 12 education, even higher education. Did you ever have a listening class?
No.
No.
No. That is... No. So universities out there need to, yeah.
I mean, there's no standard for teaching and learning listening. And what's interesting is there's 4 ways in which minds connect. And that's really what communication is about, right? Is connecting minds. We have speaking and listening. And then we have writing and reading. And a good amount of time is spent on writing. A good amount of time is spent on reading. And a little bit of time is spent on speaking. But listening is something that we probably do the majority of our lives, as far as the 4 different ways that minds connect. And there really isn't, there's an assumption made that we all know how to listen well to each other. Some people have that gift. They just have always had it. But like any other skill, someone who's a great public speaker, some people have that gift, but it's a practice. And so is listening. So that's a great important thing to weave into a container building process. But it can change based upon the group. So let's say you do that the first time, then you realize that what this group really needs to practice is being mindful of the assumptions they make. So maybe you can have an exercise about, are we making any assumptions? How can we become more mindful of the assumptions we make? So it's really about evaluating the qualities of dialogue and what's most important for this group to practice before we really get into this main dialogue that might be more content driven. And guidelines too. How can we make sure that everyone understands this is a safe space? Whether it's confidentiality stuff or things along those lines.
So this is an instance where, regardless of the audience, whether it be at home, within your community, or in the workplace, that there should be an opportunity for you to be able to kind of focus in on that, because ultimately one of the assumptions that could be made is that you'll probably reach your destination, your desired end destination for whatever it is that you're trying to solve, if you're actually going through this journey together and you're actually mindful, and that if there's time carved out for that, it might actually help you get to where you were and even beyond where you had thought you were going to be. Yeah.
Right. The container building takes more time, right? And in a metric-driven environment, it might be a hard sell at times. But what's better, taking the time to make sure you make the right decisions, or making a bunch of quick wrong decisions?
Right. Well, and we always talk about front loading, right? You front load all the hard work up front to be able to make sure that the foundation is there, so you can build upon that. And I think, just as far as productivity levels and efficiency levels, and ultimately, whether your team be your family at home sitting around the dining room table, in your community, that or just trying to generate a sense of community, or in the workplace, taking that time is actually going to be worthy of the investment, to be able to get to where you need to go. So I love that. Okay, so I want to be mindful of time, but there was actually, and I want to be able to continue this conversation. So listeners, stay tuned, because there's definitely more coming from Kevin, and we'll actually have more about this conversation and how you can get in contact with Kevin. We'll actually speak about that here pretty soon. But two things. You had, in our offline conversation, you had mentioned kind of this spectrum of dialogue that can happen through the generations. You take a toddler or someone learning, a toddler learning to talk and form sentences. And then you've got the other end of the spectrum where folks, senior citizens. Tell us how a toddler approaches dialogue, or what your perception is or your observation is, versus a senior citizen. So let's start there, like both ends of the spectrum. Right. Are there similarities? Are there major differences?
Right. So, like I said, my initial work in the field of dialogue was with K through 12 educators. So we spent a lot of time in the classroom observing teachers facilitating dialogue with kids. And then when I started my Full Circle Dialogue project, I ended up bringing creative aging workshops into retirement communities and bringing the power of dialogue into retirement communities. And it was really interesting to see that though there was such a big age gap between the seniors in the retirement communities I was working with and kids in the classroom, there was something similar. And it was really the fact that it was easier for them to tap into what they call in Zen philosophy, the beginner's mind, to be able to see things freshly, to suspend your pre-existing positions on certain topics. Kids don't have pre-existing positions, and elders have kind of shed away their egoic tendencies of this is the only way I can see it, this is right, because they're no longer in a position where people in the space in between kids and in between elders, most of us are wrapped up in our careers and wrapped up in all the things that we self-identify with. So the first thing that you really say to someone when you meet someone for the first time, when you're in that space between, is, my name's so-and-so, what do you do? And then what do you do? And that doesn't happen in those other generational spaces. And I think there's a big lesson to be taught there, because a big aspect of mindfulness and dialogue that I teach to the people in the space between that are in their careers and still in the process of holding on tightly to all the different ways that they identify with themselves is it's a quality called the principle of participation. To truly participate with the moment and be present with people without giving in to those egoic urges that we get that keep tapping us on the shoulder that no, you're right, this is right, that's wrong. And that really stifles creativity a lot of times. It stifles the ability to come up with new ideas, and it stifles our ability to truly connect. So I just found that those in the classroom, the kids that are younger and the seniors in retirement communities, they're so far apart in age, but they have that one thing in common, that their relationship to their opinions is much more playful and it's much more curious. And not only is that super beneficial to your own personal health, But as far as working with a group, working in a team, and coming up with new ideas, to have different opinions, but to have the same relationship of mindful inquiry and curiosity with those opinions, that's something that we can all learn from the people that we tend to think can't offer us anything.
Right.
Right. But there's a ton of wisdom on both ends of the spectrum that those of us who think we all have it together much more could learn from.
I love that, and I love the playful and curious piece too. I think we could, yeah, you're right. We can absolutely learn more from the toddlers in our lives and the older generations. I love that. Is there one takeaway that our listeners can move on through their day with today, just to even for consideration or to put into practice, that they can start developing this more engaged or more meaningful dialogue?
I touched on it a bit earlier, but I think that just the practice of deep listening, the practice of making your goal to understand the person in front of you. Stephen Covey has a great quote that I'm sure some of you have heard, that seek to understand before you seek to be understood, which is really all about listening. And it will yield huge dividends. You might think, well, what if I can't get a word in edgewise, and what if they win? But you win if they win, because now you're trusted.
So folks that perhaps are listening on the way to work today, or on their way home, or are trying to understand how they might be able to bridge the gap, either because they aren't able to achieve what they have their mindset on, or what they need to be able to do, but they have to work within a community where perhaps they're not feeling heard, valued, or understood, to go in with the mindset of if the other person feels heard, valued, and understood, that know or trust the process and the fact that you'll ultimately both win at the end of that. Yeah.
Right, and just let go of outcomes and just be as present as you can in the moment. And just know that your presence, your modeling of mindfulness and compassion has a good chance of yielding that back. When we get argumentative and we start attacking someone, they attack us back. And the same thing can be said about conversational qualities on the other end of the spectrum. And it's hard because you're not used to getting that back from certain people. But if you're just patient and you just practice deep listening, I mean, how often do we listen to the point where the next time we talk because the other person said, so, what do you think? A lot of times it's like a game of fast jump rope, and we jump in before we were even asked to. And we think we're helping the other person, but really, was that more for us or for them? Was that about us trying to satisfy our own desire to be heard, understood, and valued? Or was it really to help? And there's a difference between asking a clarifying question because you genuinely don't understand, and asking a question that's really a hidden statement. And trying to fix someone's problems that maybe they didn't ask for you to fix for them. Maybe you fix it just by listening and being present.
I love that. I can think of a number of areas of my life where perhaps I need to actually practice that. Well, this has been a great conversation, Kevin. Before we wrap up, we have a couple of just quick questions that we ask each of our guests. So if you're okay with that, we'll swing into those. Sure. So what was your first job, and what did you learn from that you still use today?
My first job ever?
Yeah.
My first job ever was I was working in the kitchen at... I'm originally from a small town, Walla Walla, Washington, and there's a local brew pub in town, the Mill Creek Brew Pub. It's a restaurant bar, and I worked back in the kitchen. Excuse my language. It's kind of, my parents joked around and said that I was the kitchen bitch because I was a jack of all trades, and I was doing dishes, and I was making sandwiches, and I was mopping floors, and all that good stuff. And what did I learn from that experience? I learned I learned to be humble because I looked at that job as this is my first job and I'm going to have some extra spending money. But I worked alongside some people who, were in their late 20s, early 30s, and that was their job.
Raising families.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always learned that, appreciate wherever you're at, because you just never know what circumstance you might be in where that becomes your full-time job. So.
That's great. Okay. I'm sure you made a great sandwich too.
Yeah, I did all right.
So what have you read, listened to, or watched recently that you'd actually recommend to our listeners?
I started reading a very interesting book recently by Mortimer Adler, who's influenced my work a lot. But it's just simply called How to Speak and How to Listen. And it seems like, well, how long could that book be? But he really dissects both practices. And I repeated a couple things that he says today, but it was very, very helpful. Very, very helpful to me as far as how I deliver messages and how I receive them. And what's more important than that.
Right. That's great. Well, we'll have a link in the show notes to that book so folks can check that out. Yeah. That's great. How to Speak and How to Listen. Well, there's a title that's self-explanatory, isn't it?
Not much ambiguity there.
No, I love that. Okay, so Kevin, you're sitting down having a sandwich with your 90-year-old self. What do you think he would say to you today?
Sitting down having a sandwich with my 90-year-old self. What would he say to me? What would he say to me? I don't know, I feel...
Well, okay, let's shake this up a little. What would you ask him?
What would I ask him? I would ask him what the biggest mistake he ever made was and would he do anything differently. It's kind of scary. But I get torn between asking a question like that and, trying to change how my life goes, and then maybe not asking anything almost, and just going through life and realizing that things are out of my control. Now I'm really starting to think I intentionally maybe wouldn't want to ask anything. Because then I'd be trying to control the destiny of my life.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think that's a dangerous path to go on.
Interesting.
We don't have control.
No.
We don't have control.
Gotta let it go. And have a good time, right? Just enjoy the ride.
Cool. Very philosophical. What would you ask?
No, we've had some really great answers. All the answers are great, right? Because the question came about because people are always like, oh, what would you say to your 20-year-old self? And my response to that is, well, unless there's a time machine, I can't, for my own benefit, I can't do that. So, and I'd be happy to share my wisdom with others, but what I want to do is be able to look forward and try and figure out what it is, what wisdom my future self would impart on me today, and perhaps I have the ability to be able to do something about that for the back nine of my life.
Right.
So, anyway, okay. All right, so Kevin, how do folks get in touch with you?
Well, you can go to my website, www.fullcircledialog.com. You can find me on Instagram @fullcircledialog. And if you have any inquiries about bringing me in to do dialogue work in a community or organization you're associated with, or even doing some one-on-one coaching on how to facilitate conversations best, or anything in the dialogue arena, just shoot me an email at kevin@fullcircledialog.com.
Great. And we'll actually have Kevin's full contact details at thecareerq.com in the show notes, so be sure to check us out there. Kevin, this has been a fantastic dialogue.
It was.
I hope, as far, on the scale of mindfulness and interconnectedness, that you feel like this was a positive conversation. I think there's such value in just again in the speed in which we move through life, just to be able to take that pause and be more present and be more mindful. And sometimes it takes someone like you to remind us, to give us the tools and to be able to remind us to put those things into practice. So thank you again. We actually look forward to continuing the conversation with you. So we'd love to have you back, and that way we can actually keep working on this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, so, all right. So again, check us out at thecareerq.com. Lots of show notes, links to more information about Kevin, and we will catch you guys next time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to head on over to thecareerq.com where you can get more information, show notes, and related articles to today's topic. Also, if you like what you're hearing, head on over to iTunes, subscribe to the podcast, and make sure you leave us a rating and a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks again.
The Career Q is recorded by Lens Group Media at the Seattle Impact Hub.